For more than 13 centuries, a vast human network operated across deserts, coastlines, and bustling port cities, one that reshaped entire continents, but was rarely spoken about in classrooms or documentaries. Long before European ships ever reached West Africa, Arab slave traders were capturing and exporting millions of African men, women, and children, creating one of the longest-running and least acknowledged forced labor systems in human history. This was a trade built on endurance, secrecy, and power, one that moved silently through the pages of time, leaving deep scars that still echo across generations. In this story, we will uncover how this system functioned, why it lasted so long, and how it affected the lives of millions who were taken from their homes. We will explore the routes carved across the Sahara, the markets that thrived on human suffering, and the cultural forces that kept the trade alive for more than a millennium. Most importantly, we will give voice to those whose stories were nearly erased, people who endured unimaginable journeys yet left behind traces of courage, resilience, and humanity. If you believe history deserves to be remembered honestly, and if you want more documentaries that shine light on the chapters the world often forgets, make sure to support this channel. Please take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Your support helps us continue creating meaningful content, uncovering untold histories, and bringing overlooked stories back into the light. Now, let us step into a world shaped by silence, survival, and the struggle for freedom, a story that spans 13 centuries and still shapes our understanding of the past today. As we move deeper into this history, it becomes clear that the story did not end when the last caravans faded from the Sahara, or when European empires shifted their attention elsewhere. While many parts of the world gradually abandoned systems of forced servitude, the institution persisted far longer in several regions of the Arab world, shaped by entrenched traditions, social hierarchies, and economic structures that proved resistant to change. The legacy of the 13th century trade did not simply vanish with time. Instead, it lingered in everyday life, woven into households, marketplaces, and social expectations in ways that would outlast entire empires. By the 20th century, when many nations were already redefining concepts of freedom and human rights, the reality in places such as Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Oman, and the territories that would become the United Arab Emirates told a different story. In these societies, where the past held powerful influence, the transition away from long-standing systems of bondage happened slowly and often under intense international pressure. Old patterns were deeply rooted. Families passed down responsibilities and social roles across generations, and the practice had become so normalized over centuries that dismantling it required more than laws. It required shifting the mindset of entire communities. In Saudi, for instance, the formal abolition came only in 1962, driven by global scrutiny and changing economic relationships. Yet even then, the transition was complex. People who had lived their entire lives within traditional hierarchies suddenly found themselves navigating a world that demanded new identities and opportunities. Similar stories unfolded in Yemen, Oman, where the end of the practice arrived in the mid-1960s and early 1970s, marking the close of an era that had shaped social structures for hundreds of years. The regions that later formed the UAE also moved away from these systems during the decades leading up to statehood in 1971. But remnants of the past still echoed through older generations who had lived within that world. Yet perhaps the most striking example of endurance lies in Mauritania, a nation where the issue took on a unique form shaped by centuries of cultural tradition. There, certain communities experienced hereditary servitude roles passed from parent to child, not through formal ownership but through social expectation and long-established custom. Official abolition occurred several times, beginning in 1981 and reinforced by later reforms. Yet the struggle continued as invisible boundaries within society remained difficult to break. The line between the past and the present was not easily erased, especially when generations had grown up accepting a system that had existed longer than any living memory. This persistence reminds us that the history of forced servitude in the region was not just an event, but a deeply embedded social structure. It shaped identities, influenced relationships between communities, and created divisions that would carry forward even after the legal end of the practice. Understanding this context helps illuminate why the memory of the trade feels closer to the present in some places than in others, and why the stories of those affected remain vital to any honest discussion of the past. The endurance of this system across the centuries speaks to how powerful cultural norms can be, and how the echoes of history continue to shape modern societies long after the original structures have been dismantled. This chapter of the story is not meant to cast blame on regions or cultures, but to recognize the complexity of history and the weight of systems that persisted far beyond the moments when the world declared them over. It shows how time alone does not erase old structures. Change requires understanding, acknowledgement, and the willingness to confront realities that have shaped generations. Only by tracing the long arc of this history can we understand the depth of its impact and the resilience of those who lived through it, navigating a world where the legacy of the past still lingered just beneath the surface. Across the long arc of this history, certain practices emerged that reveal just how tightly controlled and deeply stratified the system had become. And one of the most telling was the way male captives were treated before being sent into markets across the Middle East and beyond. It was not described openly in official records, yet its presence drifts through travel accounts, administrative notes, and the memories passed down through families across generations. To understand it within the broader story, we must see it as part of a larger machinery built on the idea that human lives could be shaped, restricted, or redirected to fit the needs of those who benefited from the trade. This was not a sudden development, but rather something that grew out of the same logic that allowed the system to operate for more than 13 centuries, long after similar institutions were abolished elsewhere. In the earlier sections of this story, we traced how entire communities were targeted because their strength, agricultural skill, or domestic labor could be monetized across expanding networks that stretched from inland Africa to bustling coastal ports on the Red Sea and across the Indian Ocean. We followed how families were separated, how journeys across deserts reshaped identities, and how many regions continued these systems well into the 20th century. Within that same landscape, the treatment of male captives reveals a parallel thread, one that speaks to how value was calculated in ways that extended far beyond simple labor. It reflected anxieties about lineage, inheritance, social hierarchy, and the desire for absolute control within households and institutions. Travelers from various cultures wrote, often with shock, about how many male captives arrived at markets unable to father children, a condition deliberately imposed before they ever reached their final destinations. Although the accounts vary in tone and detail, they consistently point to the same underlying intention: preventing the formation of future generations that might claim kinship, property, or social standing within the households where they served. In societies where lineage carried immense importance, this ensured that any loyalty or attachment would remain firmly directed toward the household's established family rather than toward biological descendants of the captives themselves. This practice also transformed the social roles available to these men. They often served in positions requiring deep trust, overseeing households, protecting trade caravans, or working within administrative structures, roles that would have been far more fraught if captives were able to form families of their own. For the system's operators, this made them safer investments, individuals who were expected to channel their efforts into service alone. Seen from the outside, however, it reveals a system built on the belief that every aspect of a captive's life, including the future they might have lived, could be reshaped for someone else's benefit. Yet even within this system, resilience appeared in unexpected places. Some captives managed to rise into positions of influence. Others earned trust and eventually freedom. And many carried stories that spread across trade routes and into later generations. Their experiences highlight both the severity of the restrictions placed upon them and the remarkable human ability to adapt, endure, and reshape identity even in circumstances designed to limit every possibility. By weaving this chapter into the broader narrative, the continuity becomes clear. The endurance of the system for more than a millennium, the late abolition across several regions, the persistent social structures that survived long after each piece connects to a world where power was preserved not only through labor and trade, but also through carefully designed controls over the lives of those who were taken. As this story continues to unfold, the voices of those who witnessed the trade from the outside add another layer to our understanding, revealing how the system operated far beyond the boundaries of official records or economic calculations. Among the most cited observers was the explorer David Livingstone, whose journeys through East and Central Africa intersected with caravan routes used for transporting captives. His accounts were not written as political statements or academic studies, but as immediate impressions of what he encountered along riverbanks, forest paths, and bustling trading posts. Because of that, his words carry a certain weight, capturing moments that might otherwise have vanished into silence. They must be read carefully, not as the whole truth but as pieces of a larger mosaic that includes the experiences of those who lived through these events, the traditions of local communities, and the broader rhythms of regional history. In tracing how earlier sections of this narrative describe the long duration of the trade, the strict systems of control, and the ways captives were reshaped to fit the demands of new environments, Livingstone's accounts offer another perspective on how these operations affected people on the move. He often found himself crossing the same terrain used by caravans, and what he witnessed reflected the strain and exhaustion that defined many of these forced journeys. According to his journals, the caravans move with little regard for those who fell behind, particularly women carrying heavy loads or caring for young children. His descriptions are restrained but unmistakably concerned, emphasizing how vulnerable travelers struggled during long marches through rugged landscapes, where harsh climate and scarce resources pushed human endurance to its limits. These glimpses into the conditions of travel are particularly significant because they echo the earlier sections of this story, which highlighted how control over captives went far beyond the markets themselves. The system was not confined to the moment of sale. It extended across deserts, forests, ports, and oceans. Livingstone's observations capture part of that journey, illustrating how the pressures placed on those who were already deprived of freedom intensified with every mile. The challenges of hunger, fatigue, and long distances formed a hidden layer of the trade, one that rarely appeared in official ledgers, but shaped the fate of countless individuals. His writing also reflects how profoundly isolated these travelers were, cut off from their homes, their cultural rhythms, and their sense of belonging. Women caring for children were especially vulnerable, as the demands of the journey left little room for rest or protection. When Livingstone later shared these accounts with audiences in Europe, many readers were confronted for the first time with a reality that had long existed far from their awareness, a reality that did not match the more sanitized descriptions circulated by some trading networks. This emerging contrast helped illuminate the full scale of the system, adding emotional clarity to the economic and political patterns researchers have since uncovered. Yet even within Livingstone's accounts, a deeper thread emerges, one that connects to the resilience described earlier in the narrative. Many of the captives he encountered showed remarkable determination, finding ways to support one another, maintain fragments of identity, and hold on to hope in circumstances that offered little comfort. These glimpses of courage, though understated in his journals, serve as reminders that the people he encountered were not merely victims of a system, but individuals whose stories, traditions, and strength contributed to the survival of entire communities. By placing Livingstone's observations alongside the structural patterns already described centuries-long endurance, strict forms of control, and the social logic behind practices imposed on captives, the continuity of the narrative becomes clearer. His accounts serve not as isolated anecdotes, but as lived testimony that enriches the broader picture, showing how the trade affected people not only in markets or households, but throughout every phase of their journey. As the narrative stretches across centuries, the scale of the system becomes clearer not through a single set of numbers, but through the convergence of many independent studies, oral traditions, and historical records. Earlier sections of this story traced how the trade reached deep into African interiors, how people were taken far from familiar landscapes, and how entire routes across deserts and coastlines became woven into global patterns of demand. To understand the enormity of what unfolded, historians have spent decades piecing together caravan logs, merchant correspondence, regional chronicles, and demographic shifts, all of which help illuminate the human cost behind a system that operated for well over a millennium. Across this body of research, estimates of how many people were taken vary widely. Yet even the most cautious numbers reveal an immense movement of human lives. Many scholars place the total number of individuals transported into markets across North Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Asia somewhere between 10 and 20 million. A figure that reflects not only those who reached distant ports, but also those who passed through inland collection points, improvised camps, and caravans moving between regions. These numbers do not stand alone. They connect to earlier descriptions of how families were separated, how identities were reshaped, and how the trade continued long after similar systems elsewhere had come to an end. What often shocks modern readers is that some researchers suggest an even broader toll when considering those who did not survive the journeys. Harsh climate, long distances, limited access to water, and the pressures imposed by caravan schedules meant that many people faced extreme hardship before reaching coastal markets or inland hubs. In some studies based on both historical testimony and demographic modeling, the number of lives lost along the routes is estimated to be far higher than those who survived the journeys. While scholars debate the accuracy of these figures, some estimates speak of tens of millions of deaths over the many centuries the system existed. These numbers, however approximate, underscore a truth already woven through the earlier chapters of this story. The trade reshaped entire populations, leaving marks on regions that can still be traced today. When read alongside eyewitness accounts described earlier, such as those recorded by David Livingstone, these estimates gain emotional depth. His journals captured moments along the routes where exhaustion and scarcity pushed travelers to the limits of endurance, especially women carrying young children or older individuals unable to keep pace. His testimony echoes the demographic findings. The conditions of the journey were as devastating as the markets themselves. Combined with the earlier discussion of how strict systems of control operated, from the restructuring of captive identities to the prevention of future generations, the numerical estimates reveal not only the extent of the trade, but the variety of pressures that shaped its human impact. Yet beyond the numbers lies another layer of continuity with the rest of this narrative. Each estimate represents not just data but stories and memories. Musicians whose traditions shifted after communities were displaced. Families whose histories contain gaps that can never fully be recovered. And regions where cultural landscapes evolved under the weight of this prolonged upheaval. The patterns described in earlier sections, routes stretching across continents, networks sustained over hundreds of years, and systems designed to control every aspect of captive life, become even more vivid when viewed through this demographic lens. What emerges is a picture of a vast, enduring institution that reshaped entire societies, The exact totals may never be known, but the collective evidence historical, demographic, and personal reveals a legacy that stretches far beyond the numbers themselves. As the story moves deeper into the forces that allowed this system to endure for more than 1,000 years, another dimension begins to surface, one that does not exist on the desert routes or in the crowded ports, but in writings, teachings, and narratives that shaped how generations understood the world around them. Earlier sections described how the trade drew strength from economic demand, strict systems of control, and geographic networks stretching across continents. Yet these practical structures could not have survived on their own. They were supported by ideas that gave the system moral cover, ideas that appeared in commentaries, historical works, and interpretations crafted by influential voices who sought to frame the hierarchy between different communities as something ordained or natural. Many of these texts emerged in a period when scholars, theologians, and chroniclers held enormous influence over public life. Their interpretations often blended spiritual beliefs with social realities, creating narratives that portrayed certain groups as destined for particular roles within society. This shaping of perception did not happen abruptly. It developed gradually, gaining strength as the trade expanded and the need for ideological reassurance grew. By describing certain populations as suited for servitude or as outsiders to specific cultural identities, these interpretations provided a language that made the system appear orderly rather than exploitative. In connecting this thread to the earlier discussions about forced journeys, the treatment of male captives, and the immense demographic toll, it becomes clear how powerful these narratives were. They influenced not only how traders viewed the people they transported, but also how broader societies perceived the institution itself. When a system is justified through writings that paint entire communities as naturally subordinate, resistance becomes more difficult and change becomes far slower. These ideas created a lens through which many generations viewed the individuals taken from African regions, shaping assumptions and expectations long before caravans ever reached trading centers. What makes this particularly striking is how it contrasts with the reality revealed in eyewitness accounts, such as those shared by David Livingstone. His journals describe travelers who demonstrated courage, endurance, and a deep instinct for survival, qualities that directly contradicted the narratives crafted by certain scholars. The tension between these lived realities and the written justifications shows how the system relied on more than physical control. It depended on shaping memory, identity, and belief. These ideas also played a role in how the system survived so long and why abolition came so late in many regions. By framing the trade as an established social order, it became intertwined with political structures, household traditions, and economic practices. Even when outside pressures began pushing for change, deeply rooted beliefs slowed the process, creating a gap between moral debates and actual transformation. This echoes earlier chapters recounting how abolition in some regions occurred only in the mid-20th century, and how certain communities continued to struggle with its legacy long after. Yet even within this framework of justification, there were always countercurrents, voices who questioned the interpretations, communities who resisted, and individuals whose lives demonstrated the richness and resilience of the cultures affected. Traditions, languages, and memories survived despite the weight placed upon them, offering evidence that cultures cannot be neatly contained within roles assigned by others. Their survival challenges the narratives that once tried to define them, and represents a form of quiet defiance woven through generations. By weaving this chapter into the broader narrative, the continuity becomes unmistakable. The scale of the trade, the harshness of the journeys, the restructuring of identities, and the demographic impact all intersect with the ideas used to justify the system. It is in this intersection between belief and action, narrative and reality, that the full shape of this history emerges, showing how a trade that spanned centuries relied not only on economic power but also on stories crafted to sustain, within the wider tapestry already explored, where long routes carved across deserts, where social hierarchies were reinforced through narratives, and where generations lived under systems designed to shape every aspect of identity, another strand emerges, one tied to the roles certain individuals came to occupy within major cities, courts, and households across the region. The earlier chapters discussed how male captives were subjected to measures intended to limit lineage and maintain strict control within domestic and administrative spaces. Those measures did not exist in isolation. They were driven by the economic and social value assigned to a distinct class of servants whose presence became woven into the functioning of palaces, trade centers, and influential households. These individuals occupied positions that demanded unwavering loyalty, discretion, and proximity to powerful families. They served as attendants in private quarters, guarded entrances to inner chambers, managed correspondence, oversaw trade storage, and often acted as intermediaries between elite households and the outside world. In some cases, they rose to remarkably high administrative ranks, trusted with responsibilities that would normally be reserved for close kin. This trust was not granted freely. It stemmed from a belief that, because their personal futures had been forcefully redirected, they posed no challenge to household inheritance or lineage. Their existence within this structure served both symbolic and practical purposes, reinforcing the idea that a household's inner circle could remain protected while still relying on individuals capable of handling complex tasks. This role became deeply embedded in the cultural and political life of many cities. Markets, courts, and administrative centers all relied on these individuals, sometimes in large numbers, which created an ongoing demand that stretched back into the interior routes already described in earlier parts of this narrative. Traders understood that certain households valued such servants highly, especially those who displayed discipline, multilingual ability, or organizational skill. As a result, caravan networks continued supplying this demand, shaping not only how captives were transported but how certain individuals were selected, trained, and prepared for these specialized positions. The continuation of the system, therefore, was not just a product of tradition but also of economic logic, when placed alongside the earlier sections that discussed long-distance transport, harsh journeys, and the demographic impact on African regions. This chapter shows another facet of how the trade influenced both ends of its route. On the African side, communities lost individuals whose strength, intelligence, and adaptability might have contributed to local leadership or generational continuity. On the receiving end, these same qualities were redirected towards strengthening the structures of powerful households. The contrast highlights how the system extracted both physical labor and intellectual potential, shaping societies in ways that stretched far beyond immediate economic exchange. The writings described earlier, which offered cultural or religious justification for the hierarchy, played a role here as well, by framing this class of servants as essential yet permanently set apart. They contributed to a narrative that made the system seem not only acceptable, but necessary for orderly governance and household management. This ensured that the demand for such roles continued into later centuries, even as global attitudes toward the trade began to shift. What is striking is that many of these individuals, despite the restrictions placed upon their personal lives, left subtle marks on the institutions they served. Some became skilled administrators who shaped regional policies. Others acted as cultural mediators connecting distant regions, and many influenced the rhythm of daily life in homes and courts. Their presence, though rarely highlighted in traditional histories, formed an essential part of the social fabric. By integrating this chapter into the broader narrative, one that has already traced long journeys, societal hierarchies, ideological justifications, and the sheer human scale of the system, the continuity becomes even more pronounced. This was not a simple trade of labor, but a complex structure in which economic demand, social control, and carefully crafted narratives worked together, sustaining a system that shaped countless lives over many centuries. Across every chapter of this long and difficult history, one truth continues to rise to the surface. The impact of this system did not end when the caravans stopped moving or when the last legal codes were repealed. Earlier sections trace the roots, the justifications, the roles imposed on captives, and the vast human cost estimated by scholars. But the legacy that remains today reaches far deeper than the numbers themselves. Many African regions still carry demographic imbalances shaped by centuries of removal, with certain communities losing generations of young people whose absence altered family lines. Cultural transmission and local leadership. Languages shifted, traditions adapted, and entire regions found their histories interrupted in ways that continue to shape identity and memory. The cultural consequences are equally profound. Music, spiritual practices, and oral histories across large parts of Africa preserve echoes of those who never returned, reflecting both grief and resilience. In some areas, communities crafted new stories to explain the gaps left behind, while in others, silence became a way to cope with loss too great to articulate. Trauma passed quietly through generations, not always spoken openly but carried in collective memory. And yet, despite the scope of this history, global recognition remains limited. While the Atlantic trade is widely documented, memorialized, and discussed in classrooms and public spaces around the world, the system that lasted longer and affected vast regions across East, Central, and Southern Africa receives far less attention on the international stage. This absence is not merely an oversight. It shapes understanding of global history itself. Without acknowledging the full scale of what happened, its duration, its complex networks, its ideological frameworks, and its enduring consequences, we risk leaving entire communities' experiences in the shadows. The earlier chapters of this story show that the trade was not a series of isolated incidents, but a structure that reshaped continents and influenced cultures from the African interior to the courts of major cities across the Middle East. Bringing this history into broader awareness is not about assigning blame, but about creating space for understanding, empathy, and healing. And so, as this narrative comes to a close, the hope is that it encourages deeper reflection, wider conversation, and a more complete memory of the past. Every account, every testimony, every preserved song or story adds to a fuller picture of humanity's shared history. Thank you for spending your time listening to this journey, for engaging with a subject that deserves far more global attention, and for helping keep these stories alive. If you found this exploration meaningful, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel so more people can discover these important histories.